Hello again, Planeswalkers. This is Eric from Bane Alley Magic, bringing you another deck tech video. Today we're talking about the latest update to my Edgar Markov deck, but first a quick update about me. First off, I went to the Grand Prix in Las Vegas, and it was just way too expensive to join any of the events. To give you an idea of how expensive it was, it cost $40 just to play casual Commander. $40, no prizes, $40 just to sit in the play area and fish for a game. Something I could do at my local game store completely for free. Actually, it's something I did for free just by walking outside of the Grand Prix, and that is where I met Seth, aka Saffron Olive, and Krim, the Asian Avenger. Needless to say, the Goldfish guys were super nice. As for my personal life, I'm studying like crazy for my upcoming Praxis exam, a test I must pass in order to get a master's degree, get into the master's degree program to become a social studies teacher. The Praxis is like the bar exam for social studies. I need to become an expert in U.S. history, world history, political science, geography, economics, and psychology. Regardless, I've still been playing Magic, but I haven't been building many new decks. This will probably be the last deck tech video I put out for a long time. I feel like I had to do it because not only is this deck fabulous, but I also wrote a song about it. Click the link in the top right to check out my crappy music video. Now on to the deck. Our commander is Edgar Markov. 3 and Mardu colors, that's red, white, black, for a 4/4 legendary creature vampire knight with eminence. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He has first strike and haste, and whenever Edgar Markov attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Eddie Mac is a very unique deck. It's both vampire tribal and tokens. Tokens is a very powerful strategy all by itself because it gives you what I like to call board advantage. Similar to card advantage, token decks get board advantage by using one card to make multiple permanents, while your opponents are usually just getting one permanent per card. On top of giving us an abundance of creatures, Eddie Mac comes out late in the game as the ultimate vampire lord, giving all of our vampires, including himself, +1/+1 counters. This only happens when he attacks, but because he has haste, he gets to attack right away. And if all else fails, he's also great at killing your opponents with commander damage, as he gets even bigger every time he attacks. So the strategy of this deck is to go aggro, making tons of vampires and killing the opponents through combat. Some people like to make it a combo deck with the aristocrats theme, or maybe they might drain their own life and then switch life totals with someone else, but that's not for me. For this deck, I like to keep it simple. Kick ass and take names. So let's get into the deck, starting with the vampires. I run 30 vampires in the deck and 2 non-vampire creatures, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the tokens. One of the most fun things about playing a token deck is making your own tokens. One of the websites that I use for making my tokens is mtgcardsmith.com. You can go the expensive route and print your tokens on cardstock, or you can just print them on normal paper and then put them in the front of basic lands with a penny sleeve. So here's some of my tokens that I made. First we got, the white vampire token with lifelink token is just so crappy, so I had to replace that with Tom Cruise here from Interview with the Vampire. As far as my black vampire tokens, we got Vampire Hunter D, awesome manga. Or it's not even a manga, they're really just novels. Awesome movie. Then we have Nosferatu, so creepy. Of course, we gotta have The Lost Boys, Eat Those Noodles, Michael. And then we got some From Dusk Till Dawn guys, you know. I've got Vampira. We got Uncle Munster from the Munsters. And then, yes, the Count. 1, 2. I love this one. Gotta have your own tokens. So if you're playing a token deck, at least have tokens. You know, don't use dice to represent your creatures. That just always confuses people, and they end up attacking you, and you're like, oh, I block with my dice, and they're like, what? I thought that was your life total, you know, whatever. So don't use dice, use tokens, and if you can, make your own tokens. It's a lot of fun. So let's get into the actual creatures. We talked about Edgar Markov. So our first vampire here is Viscera Seer, a 1/1 vampire wizard for 1 black. And he says sacrifice a creature to scry 1. So to scry 1, you look at the top card of your library, then you may put that card on the top or bottom of your library. So having a sacrifice outlet in Commander is really important, because sacrificing your creature is a great way to respond to your opponent's exiling your creature, to your opponent's enchanting your creature, to your opponent's gaining control of your creatures or making copies of your creatures. You know, you can sacrifice them instead. And then of course vampires have some aristocrat abilities, so when you sacrifice your creatures you might be draining your opponents of life and whatnot. And so yeah, having a lot of cheap vampires is also really important in this deck, just to get those vampire tokens coming out as quickly as possible. Let's put Eddie over here. Okay, so next we have Vampire of the Dire Moon, a newer vampire from the Magic 2020 set. 1 black for a 1/1 vampire with Death Touch and Lifelink. You know, this is another vampire with Death Touch and Lifelink. They're just really good. You know, you have Vampire Nighthawk. You have the Aetherborn vampire from the Kaladesh set, and you know, yeah, all of them with Death Touch and Lifelink. It's just a great little combo there. So another nice cheap vampire. Next we have Stromkirk Noble, 1 red for a 1/1 vampire. Stromkirk Noble can't be blocked by humans, sometimes relevant. And whenever Stromkirk Noble deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it gets bigger the more it deals combat damage to a player. Next we have Sky Marcher Aspirant, 1 white for a 2/1 vampire soldier with Ascend. So if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. Either if you control the permanents when you cast this spell, or if this is on the board and then you eventually get 10 or more permanents, you will then also get the city's blessing, and you just get it for the rest of the game. So Sky Marcher Aspirant has flying as long as you have the city's blessing. Next we have Falkenrath Exterminator, 1 and a red for a 1/1 vampire archer. Whenever Falkenrath Exterminator deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And you can pay 2 and a red, and Falkenrath Exterminator deals damage to target creature equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on Falkenrath Exterminator. So this is really important in the deck because in our non-creature spells we don't have a ton of removal, so there's quite a few vampires that actually have removal on themselves. And as long as you have the mana, you can activate Falkenrath Exterminator as many times as you want. Next we have Paladin of Atonement, 1 and a white for a 1/1 vampire knight that says at the beginning of each upkeep, if you lost life this turn, or if you lost life last turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Paladin of Atonement. And when Paladin of Atonement dies, you gain life equal to its toughness. Gaining life is a little important in this deck just to help us draw cards and not kill ourselves, and we'll get into that later. Next we have Blood Artist, 1 and a black for a 0/1 vampire. It says whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So a little bit of that aristocrat's effect here. Cordial Vampire is 2 black for a 1/1 vampire. Whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So you can pump up your whole team just by sacrificing a creature, or, killing one of your opponent's creatures, or sometimes your opponents are sacrificing their own creatures, and then your whole team just gets pumped up. So this is a really nice card from the Modern Horizons set. Next we have Dusk Legion Zealot. 1 and a black for a 1/1 vampire soldier. When Dusk Legion Zealot enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose 1 life. The one thing this deck could probably use more of is card draw. So, it's just kind of hard to fit it all in when you got like 30 vampires, which is about how much you want in a tribal deck, right? But also having enough room for, ramp spells and draw spells and removal spells. So yeah, the one thing this deck is probably lacking a little bit is draw, which really sucks. So I've got quite a few, creatures in here that just either replace themselves or draw some more cards. Next we have Bloodseeker. 1 and a black for a 1/1 vampire shaman. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose 1 life. Yeah, this one might get hated out pretty quickly, but it's so cool. And if your opponents can't deal with it, it'll just kill them. Next we have Legion Lieutenant. A white and a black for a 2/2 vampire knight that says other vampires you control get +1/+1. So this is our first straight up vampire lord. I think it's the only straight up 2-drop vampire lord, so really important for any vampire deck. If you're playing a vampire deck, get a Legion Lieutenant. Next we have Pitiless Pontiff. 1 and a black for a 2/2 vampire cleric. It says you can pay 1 and sacrifice another creature. Pitiless Pontiff gains Death Touch and Indestructible until the end of the turn. So this is mainly in here just as another sacrifice outlet, to prevent our opponents from enchanting our things or gaining control of our things or making copies of our creatures. It's good to have that sack outlet. Next we have Forerunner of the Legion. 2 and a white for a 2/2 vampire knight. And it says when Forerunner of the Legion enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a vampire card, reveal it, then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. And whenever another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So the second ability is not too relevant. I mean, you get a vampire entering the battlefield, maybe Edgar Markov makes another vampire token, you're adding 2 power to your team, but more importantly, you get to search for any vampire you want with Forerunner of the Legion. And that can be pretty useful because we have a lot of utility vampires in this deck, vampires that are going to help us in different situations. Next we have Yahenni, Undying Partisan. 2 and a black for a 2/2 Aetherborn vampire, who's legendary. He has haste, and it says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni, Undying Partisan. And you can sacrifice another creature, and Yahenni gains Indestructible until the end of the turn. So this is a great sacrifice outlet for any black deck, and he can just get huge. I've also seen him used as a commander, and he works really good in that deck. So just a great card, great sacrifice outlet, and he's got haste. I love haste. Haste is basically an extra combat step, where everyone else has to wait a turn to attack. You get to attack right away, and they don't even see it coming. I love haste. It's just a really great ability. Next we have Keru Mind Eater. 2 and a black for a 1/3 vampire with menace, which means it can't be blocked except for by 1 or more creature. And whenever Keru Mind Eater deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles a card from his or her hand face down. You may look at and play cards exiled with Keru Mind Eater. Thankfully we're playing 3 colors, so a lot of the time we will be able to cast those cards. Unfortunately, Keru doesn't say that we get to spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those cards, but again, we're in a 3-color deck, so we can often cast a lot of those spells. A little bit of card advantage there. Next we have Vampire Nighthawk. 1 and 2 black for a 2/3 vampire shaman with flying, death touch, and lifelink. Yeah, super powerful card here. Just some cool keyword abilities. Gain us some life. Great blocker too. Next we have Dark Imposter. 2 and a black for a 2/2 vampire assassin that says you can pay 4 and 2 black, to exile target creature and put a +1/+1 counter on Dark Imposter. Dark Imposter has all activated abilities of all creatures exiled with it. So a great little piece of removal here, great mana sink. If you got a ton of extra mana, you can always exile another target creature, hopefully one your opponent controls. But yeah, also having all the activated abilities of creatures exiled with it, that can mean anything. You could be drawing cards, it could be more removal, it could be a lot of stuff. Next we have Captivating Vampire, 1 and 2 black for a 2/2 vampire that says other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1. So a nice Lord ability. And you can tap 5 untapped vampires you control to gain control of target creature. It becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. So even if you've just cast those vampires, you can still tap them because this is an ability on Captivating Vampire. It's not one of those vampires' abilities. So even if they're summoning sick, you can still tap them to activate Captivating Vampire's ability. And you can even tap itself. It can even tap itself right away, right when it enters the battlefield, because it just says tap 5 untapped vampires you control. It doesn't have the tap symbol on it, so that's pretty cool. You can use this right away. Next we have Stromkirk Captain, 1 a black and a red for a 2/2 vampire soldier with first strike, and it says other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. That's awesome, giving all of our creatures first strike and pumping them up. Really essential card. Next we have Bishop of Binding, 3 and a white for a 1/1 vampire cleric. When Bishop of Binding enters the battlefield, exile target creature and opponent controls until Bishop of Binding leaves the battlefield. Whenever Bishop of Binding attacks, target vampire gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the power of the exiled card. So some temporary removal here. Like I said, a lot of our vampires have removal stapled onto them because we just don't run as much removal as I'd like in the non-creature spells. We do have quite a bit, but it's really helpful to have it on the creatures too. And so, not the greatest card in the deck, but he gets the job done. I've actually exiled some pretty big creatures with Bishop of Binding and got him up pretty huge. It says target vampire, but I usually have him target himself. So yeah, nice little removal. Next we have Sanctum Seeker, 2 and 2 black for a 3/4 vampire knight, and it says whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is really important, especially in situations where your opponents aren't taking any damage for some reason, like if they have Glacial Chasm out or something like that, where they're like, all damage dealt to me is reduced to 0. Well, this isn't damage, this is making them lose life. And even if they don't have something like that, this is just going to kill your opponents a lot faster and gain you some life along the way. So really important card. Next we have Twilight Prophet, 2 and 2 black for a 2/4 vampire cleric with flying and ascend. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the City's Blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is that card's converted mana cost. Whoa, that is just such an awesome ability. Normally you're the one who's losing the life, but with Twilight Prophet, your opponents are losing the life and you're gaining life. So really nice card draw here. Might get hated out pretty quickly, but we have some ways to deal with that. Next we have Bloodline Keeper, a 3/3 vampire with flying, and you can tap it to put a 2/2 black vampire creature token with flying on the battlefield, and you can pay 1 black to transform transform Bloodline Keeper. You activate this ability only if you control 5 or more vampires. So let's take a look at what he transforms into. Hey, Olivia. No, he doesn't transform into Olivia Valderin. He transforms into Lord of Lineage, which is a 5/5 vampire with flying that says other vampire creatures you control get +2/+2, and you can tap it to put a 2/2 black vampire creature token with flying on the battlefield. So this is a kind of a super lord, making all of our vampires get +2/+2 is really important at killing our opponents with combat damage. Next we have Olivia Valderin, 2 a black and a red for a 3/3 legendary vampire. And it says you can pay, and it has flying. And it says you can pay 1 and a red, and Olivia deals 1 damage to another target creature. That creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and you put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia. And for 5 mana, 3 and 2 black, you gain control of target vampire for as long as you control Olivia Valdarin. And yes, you can use both of these abilities at the same time to just pay 7 mana and gain control of target creature. So that is really spooky for your opponents. But also, just the ability to pay 2 mana and put a +1/+1 counter on her is also huge. I mean, she can get really big, really fast. Also not a bad choice as your commander. So Champion of Dusk is a 4/4 vampire knight for 3 and 2 black. And when Champion of Dusk enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. So you could potentially draw a ton of cards off of this guy. Next we have Valdarin Pariah. 3 and 2 black for a 3/3 flying vampire horror. And she says you can sacrifice 3 other creatures and transform Valdarin Pariah. And she has Madness for 3 black, so if you discard this card, you discard it into exile. When you do, you can cast it for its Madness cost or put it into your graveyard. So I don't know what's the point of saying you discard it into exile. Basically, when you discard it, you can cast it for its Madness cost. So anyway, when you sacrifice 3 creatures, Valdarin Pariah transforms into Abolisher of Bloodlines, which is a 6/5 flying Eldrazi vampire. And it says when this creature transforms into Abolisher of Bloodlines, target opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. So this is just a little bit more removal in our deck, and having them sacrifice 3 creatures can be pretty devastating. Next is Patron of the Vein. 4 and 2 black for a 4/4 vampire shaman with flying. And when Patron of the Vein enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So this is a pretty sweet card in any vampire deck. It's going to pump up our whole team as soon as it enters the battlefield. And it's also still going to allow death triggers to happen. For example, with Blood Artist, Blood Artist trigger is still going to happen because the creature first dies and then is exiled. It's not a replacement effect, it's a trigger effect. So instead of replacing it with being exiled instead of dying, it dies first and then it gets exiled. So our death triggers will still happen. That's pretty sweet. Next we have Thief of Blood. 4 and 2 black for a 1/1 flying vampire. And as Thief of Blood enters the battlefield, remove all counters from all permanents. Thief of Blood enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each counter removed this way. So again, all counters from all permanents. So that's Planeswalkers, that's -1/-1 counters, that's +1/+1 counters. There's all kinds of counters in the game. So Thief of Blood could potentially enter as a huge creature. I mean, the sky's the limit, of course, but very often this is going to enter as a 5/5, a 6/6, maybe more. And so we'll get back to Thief of Blood later. Next we have Butcher of Malakir. 5 and 2 black for a 5/4 flying vampire warrior. And whenever Butcher of Malakir or another creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So this is going to really stop your opponents from wanting to kill your creatures, because they're going to have to sacrifice a creature every time. And if you want to get rid of some creatures on their board, you can start sacrificing some of your own creatures to force them to sacrifice their creatures. So really great card, Butcher of Malakir. Next we have Vishkal, Blood Arbiter. 4, a white, and 2 black for a 5/5 legendary vampire with flying and lifelink. And it says you can sacrifice a creature to put X +1/+1 counters on Vishkal, Blood Arbiter, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. and you can remove all +1/+1 counters from Vishkal, and target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each +1/+1 counter removed this way. So this is more removal on a creature, and also having lifelink is really important in the deck. There are a couple ways where we can get a multitude of tokens on the battlefield, and when we do, we can just start picking off our opponent's creatures with Vishkal. So great sacrifice outlet, great removal, great life gain, all in one. So that brings us to our non-vampire creatures, which we have two. The first is Anger, 3 in a red for a 2/2 incarnation with haste. And as long as Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. So if you don't already know, the Angry Baby here is one of the best ways to give your creatures haste in the Commander format, because it sticks around in your graveyard, which makes it a lot harder for your opponents to deal with. So very often, if you need to discard a card, this will be the card you choose because it works best from the graveyard. If you put it on the battlefield, then you just attack someone with it every turn. One thing you can do is you can keep attacking the same player every turn, and then you're going to kind of, force them to deal with it. Either they're going to give all your creatures haste, or they're just going to die from your little 2/2 Angry Baby here. So, great card. And last creature we have is Sire of Insanity. 4, a black and a red for a 6/4 demon that says at the beginning of each end step, each player discards all his or her hand. Yeah, each player discards his or her hand, their entire hand, at the end of each end step. So that's every single player's end step. Every single player discards all the cards in their hand. So what this basically says is no one is going to have cards in their hand anymore. So why would you play this in any deck? The reason is you play it when you're ahead, right? When you have the big board state and you don't want anyone to find an answer for it, then you play Sire of Insanity. Then everyone is top decking every turn, and it's going to be really hard for your opponents to deal with your superior board state when they're just, top decking every turn, when they have no hand. So that's why you play a card like Sire of Insanity. It might seem insane, but when you're ahead of the game, that's what you want. You want no one to have any answers in their hand, and that's exactly what Sire does. So, moving along to our non-creature spells. First is Boros Charm, a red and a white for an instant. Choose one. Boros Charm deals 4 damage to target player, or permanents you control are indestructible this turn, or target creature gains double strike until the end of the turn. So this is mainly in here to protect our board against wraths. We don't have many reanimation effects. Maybe someday I'll put in Rise of the Dark Realms, but for the most part, we protect our team by making them indestructible or similar effects like that. So Boros Charm is great for making our team indestructible. Also helps out a lot if someone's trying to Armageddon, blow up all of our lands. Then this will make sure that we're left with all of our lands in that situation. But yeah, again, most importantly, just for protecting our team, protecting all of our tokens and our creatures to make sure that we can keep going aggro. And our next piece of protection is Teferi's Protection. 2 and a white for an instant. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you have protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out, and then you exile Teferi's Protection. So while your permanents are phased out, they're treated as though they don't exist, but they still do exist. They're just treated like they don't exist, and they phase in before you untap during your untap step. So this will even save your tokens. Definitely one of the best white cards ever printed for Commander. That's why it's so expensive. I really hope Wizards prints it again, because it's really essential for a white deck to have Teferi's Protection. It does only save you for 1 turn. You have to exile it after you cast it. So hopefully after that 1 turn cycle you can come back. But again, this is mainly in here to protect our board against board wipes, right? Someone's trying to blow up all our creatures or exile all of our creatures, or make us put all of our creatures on the bottom of our library, something like that. You cast a Fairy's Protection, and they're untouchable all of a sudden. All of our creatures are untouchable. All of our permanents are untouchable. So, fabulous card for any white deck. I really hope they reprint it soon. Next is Coat of Arms, which is the first of our sort of anthem effects. So Coat of Arms is 5 mana for an artifact that says each creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield that shares at least one creature type with it. For example, if 2 Goblin Warriors and a Goblin Shaman are on the battlefield, each gets +2/+2. So this is great at pumping up our whole team, making them humongous, and just winning us the game on the spot. So Coat of Arms does really good for our deck. There is a chance that your opponent is also playing a tribal deck, in which case it'll help them. So just be careful of that and make sure you're the one who's going to come out ahead. Our next anthem effect is Eldrazi Monument. 5 mana for an artifact that says creatures you control get +1/+1 and have flying and indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. If you can't, then you sacrifice Eldrazi Monument. So this not only pumps up our team, but also gives them evasion and indestructible. So this is a really spooky card for your opponents to see. So hopefully it's going to win you the game really quickly. And the last anthem effect we have here, I think, is True Conviction. 3 and 3 white for an enchantment that says creatures you control have double strike and lifelink. So yeah, late in the game, this is a really powerful card. You know, you just have a huge board, maybe pumped them up a little bit with Edgar Markov, and then you cast True Conviction, and then they're all just ridiculously powerful, giving all your creatures double strike and lifelink, you know, gaining you a ton of life. Next we have Demonic Tutor, 1 and a black for a sorcery. Search your library for 1 card and take it into your hand. This is an old printing of the card, obviously. Reshuffle your library afterwards. Yeah, sorry to say this isn't a budget-friendly deck. You know, I got some of the busted cards in here, but I really love this deck. So, you know, when you have a deck that you love, spend a little bit of money on it, you know, and if you can't, then, hey, you know, go ahead and get yourself Diabolic Tutor or whatever. But if you can afford Demonic Tutor, really great card. Next, we have our removal spells, starting with Return to Dust. 2 and 2 white for an instant. Exile target artifact or enchantment. If you cast this spell during your main phase, you may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. So you get to exile up to 2 permanents with just 1 card. That is great value on removal here. Next we have Path to Exile. 1 white for an instant. Exile target creature. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. So replacing their most powerful creature with just a land is a pretty great deal for 1 white mana. Gotta love Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. We don't have room for Swords to Plowshares in this deck, but we got plenty of the removal. Next is Crackling Doom. A red, a white, and a black for an instant. Crackling Doom deals 2 damage to each opponent. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures he or she controls. So you're making each opponent get rid of their biggest creature and dealing 2 damage to them at the same time. Pretty great deal at instant speed. Next is In Garrick's Wake. 7 and 2 black for a sorcery. Destroy all creatures you don't control and all planeswalkers you don't control. So purely one-sided board wipe. All your stuff survives, all their stuff dies. Next is Merciless Eviction. 4, a white, and a black for a sorcery. Choose 1. Either exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, or exile all planeswalkers. Yeah, all good choices. Next is Kindred Dominance. 5 and 2 black for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Destroy all creatures that aren't of the chosen type. So obviously here we're going to be choosing vampires and destroying everything that's not a vampire for a one-sided board wipe. On to our 1 planeswalker in the deck, which is Sorin Grim Nemesis. 4, a white, and a black for a planeswalker that enters with 6 loyalty counters. For +1, you reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. Each opponent loses life equal to its converted mana cost. -X, Soren Grim Nemesis deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker and you gain X life. -9, put a number of 1/1 Black Vampire Knight creature tokens with lifelink onto the battlefield equal to the highest life total among all players. So if your opponent has more life than you, you're going to be getting that many 1/1 Black Vampire Knight creature tokens with lifelink. So the last game I played with this deck, actually, I got 101 vampire tokens because my opponent was playing a Loro and he had 101 life. And so, yeah, I got a ton of vampire tokens. The first ability is really great, just, essentially drawing us a card, even though technically you're not drawing a card, you're putting it into your hand. So if something cares about you drawing a card, that won't affect that. But anyway, also the fact that each opponent loses life equal to its converted mana cost can do a ton of damage to your opponent. So Soren Grim Nemesis, just a really great planeswalker in general, really great for this deck. Next we have our card draw spells, which there aren't many, but we got Skull Clamp, which is just essential in any token deck. Any deck you have that puts out a bunch of 1/1 tokens, you gotta have Skull Clamp. So it's 1 mana for an artifact equipment. It's equipped for 1. An equipped creature gets +1/-1, and whenever equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards. So as long as you don't have any anthems out yet, each one of your tokens can basically be sacrificed for 1 mana to draw you 2 cards. Just paying 1 mana and losing a creature to draw 2 cards is actually a pretty big deal. It is great value, so I love Skull Clamp. In any token deck, it does the work. Next we have Phyrexian Arena, 1 and 2 black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So this could potentially kill you because you don't have the choice. You have to draw the card and lose 1 life. So thankfully we have quite a few ways to gain life in this deck. But even if you don't have any immediately, if you play this on turn 2 or 3, if you can, go ahead and do it. Because in Commander we start with 40 life, right? So this kit will just put you ahead of the game every time. Really great draw card spell. Next is Mind's Eye, 5 mana for an artifact that says whenever an opponent draws a card, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. So this is just a really good mana sink. If you have 3 opponents, then you could be potentially drawing 3 cards every round as long as you have the mana to pay it. So a little expensive up front, but after that, just saving 1 or 2 extra mana to draw extra cards is pretty easy and great value. Next we have Vanquisher's Banner, 5 mana for an artifact. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, so nice anthem. And whenever you cast a creature spell of the chosen type, draw a card. So every time we're casting a vampire, we're going to be drawing a card. Really essential card in any tribal deck for sure. Next is Ad Nauseam, 3 and 2 black for an instant. Reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost. You may repeat this process any number of times. So if you just have a ton of life because you played, True Conviction or something like that, you could be drawing half your deck with Ad Nauseam. I kind of go back and forth with switching this out with Necropotence. So I'm trying it out right now because Necropotence just wasn't doing it for me. Necropotence just has too many downsides. It makes you discard into exile and you skip your draw step, whereas Ad Nauseam just draws you a ton of cards. You do have to pay the life, but again, in Commander, you start with 40 life. We have ways of gaining life in this deck, so Ad Nauseam could really draw you a ton of cards with very little downside. Alright. Next we have Sunforger, which is an equipment for 3 mana. It's equipped for 3. Equipped creature gets +4/+0. And for a red and a white, you can unattach Sunforger and search your library for a red or white instant card with converted mana cost 4 or less and cast that card without paying its mana cost, then shuffle your library. This is really great in this deck because we do have a few red or white instants that are really important, in certain situations. So our choices are Boros Charm, Teferi's Protection, Return to Dust, Path to Exile, or Crackling Doom, which are basically we either have removal or we have ways to protect our board. And protecting our board is one of the most important things to do in this deck. Using Sunforger to cast Teferi's Protection, basically will nullify whatever your opponent's plan is. So really great in this deck. Next we have Anointed Procession, 3 and a white for an enchantment. If an effect would create one or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. So this works for creature tokens and treasure tokens, or whatever kind of tokens you might be making. And it says if an effect, which basically means if for any reason you would get one or more tokens, you get twice that many tokens instead. So really great in any token deck. Next we have Throne of the God Pharaoh, 2 mana for a legendary artifact that says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So this is just really great for draining all of your opponents of life really quickly. We're going aggro, we're trying to get the game over with quickly. And also in those situations where maybe your opponent has a Glacial Chasm or something that's preventing them from taking damage, well, this will get around that because they're not taking damage. Technically, they're just losing life. Next is Smothering Tithe, 3 and a white for an enchantment that says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 mana. If that player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap and sacrifice this artifact to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this can get you a ton of treasure tokens over the course of the game, especially if you get it out really early. You are not going to be having any trouble casting your spells with Smothering Tithe. I mean, who's going to want to pay 2 mana just to prevent you from getting a treasure token? Well, if they have the extra mana, sure, but if they don't, all they're doing is just giving you extra mana. Not that big of a deal compared to like Rhystic Study where you'd be drawing cards. Next is Darksteel Ingot, 3 mana for an artifact that is indestructible, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So obviously we're getting into the ramp here. Next is Commander Sphere, 3 mana for an artifact that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, or you can sacrifice Commander Sphere to draw a card. And notice that you don't have to tap it to sacrifice it, so you can both tap it to add the mana to your mana pool, float that mana, and then sacrifice it to draw a card, which you could then potentially cast with the mana that you floated. Next is the Signets. We have Orzhov Signet, 2 mana for an artifact that you can pay 1 and tap it to add both white and black to your mana pool. We have Boros Signet, same thing except it's red and white. And then we have Rakdos Signet, same thing except you get black and red. Next we have Talisman of Hierarchy, 2 mana for an artifact that you can tap for a colorless mana, or you can tap it for black or white. If you do, it deals 1 damage to you. Not a bad deal in a format where we start with 40 life. Next is Sword of the Animist, 2 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +1/+1. It's equipped for 2, and whenever the equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. This is one of the better ramp spells in all of Commander. Just 2 mana, 2 to equip, and it's not even when it deals combat damage, it's when the equipped creature attacks. You just get that basic land right onto the battlefield. Really great deal. And then we have Soul Ring. Moving along to our lands. So we have Thespian Stage, and you can probably guess what that means. So Thespian Stage is a land that taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 mana and tap it, and Thespian Stage becomes a copy of target land and gains this ability. So why do I have Thespian Stage in this deck? Well, because I also happen to have Dark Depths in this deck, which is a legendary snow land. Dark Depths enters the battlefield with 10 ice counters on it, and you can pay 3 mana to remove an ice counter from Dark Depths, or when you can also, transform Thespian Stage into Dark Depths, and since Thespian Stage is already on the battlefield, it will have no ice counters on it. And when Dark Depths has no ice counters on it, you sacrifice it. If you do, you create Merit Lage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. That's right, you get a 2020 flying indestructible creature token. That's just ridiculous and amazing. And you know, this card used to cost a lot more. It went down to like $27, so I had to get myself a copy. And the main reason I put it in this deck is because we also have Thief of Blood, which when it enters the battlefield, remove all counters from all permanents. So you can remove all the counters from Dark Depths when you cast Thief of Blood, and then Dark Depths just get sacrificed and transformed into the 2020 Flying Indestructible Merit Lage. But also, if we don't have Thief of Blood, we can also use Thespian Stage. Again, like I said, you can transform Thespian Stage into a copy of Dark Depths, and then because Thespian Stage will have no ice counters on it, it will instantly get you the 2020 Black Avatar Creature Token with Flying and Indestructible. Next we have our one fetch land, Bloodstained Mire, which is a land that you tap and pay 1 life and sacrifice to search your library for a swamp or mountain card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So that doesn't have to be a basic swamp or mountain. You could even get Blood Crypt, which is our shock land. Blood Crypt is a swamp mountain, and it taps to add black or red. And as Blood Crypt enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped. Alright, so next is Contreforts de Ombrasang, which in English is Shadow Blood Ridge. It's a land that is basically a signet. You can pay 1 and tap it to add both red and black to your mana pool, so this is fixing your mana. Again, it's a signet on a land. Then we have Secluded Steppe, the first of our 3 cycling lands. Basically, these all enter the battlefield tapped. Secluded Steppe taps to add a white to your mana pool, or you can cycle it for 1 white, which means you can pay a white to discard it from your hand and draw a different card if maybe you already have too many lands, which happens a lot. You know, sometimes you have too many lands you don't need anymore, so you just cycle them away and draw a different card. Next is Barren Moor, the exact same thing, except it's a cycling land for black. And then Forgotten Cave, the exact same thing, except it's a cycling land for red. Then we have our bounce lands, starting with Orzhov Basilica. This enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land you control to its owner's hand, and this taps to add both a white and a black mana to your mana pool. So the thing is, in Commander, you know, it's a long game format, and eventually we're going to get to that turn where we miss a land drop, you know. So even though this isn't necessarily adding extra mana to your mana pool right away, over time this will be kind of like ramp, you know. It guarantees that you're going to get 1 more land drop out of your deck, and since this taps to add both black and a white mana to your mana pool, you know, it makes up for the fact that it returns a land to your hand. And also, especially if you're playing some sort of landfall deck, you know, these are really good in any sort of landfall themed deck. But yeah, I pretty much put them in all my Commander decks because they eventually end up doing you good. You know, they're tapping for double mana. You get that land back that you return to your hand. You eventually put it back on the battlefield. And like I said, eventually you would have probably missed a land drop. So this gets you sort of an extra land drop out of the deal. And yeah, I think they work pretty good. So I have all 3 of them. I got Orzhov Basilica, I got Rakdos Carnarium, which is the same thing except for it's for red and black, and we've got Boros Garrison, which is the same thing except it's in red and white. And if you think about, you know, other ramp cards such as maybe Farseek, you know, which is 2 mana to let you search your library for a land and put it on the battlefield. I mean, this is like almost the same thing. You're kind of spending 2 mana, you know, you're returning a land to your hand, and this is entering the battlefield tapped to net yourself overall 1 extra mana on the battlefield. So I think they're definitely worth it. And it's also worth mentioning that the land that you return to your hand can be a land that you've already tapped for mana. Next is Smoldering Marsh, which is a swamp mountain, and so it can tap for red or black. And as it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. So these are what you kind of call the check lands. They check to see what kind of lands you have on the battlefield to determine whether or not they enter the battlefield tapped. So I've got a few check lands here. This is the one that is land type, Swamp Mountain. Next we have Inspiring Vantage, which enters tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. So this is more of an early game card. This taps to add red or white. And then we have Concealed Courtyard, which taps to add black or white, and it enters tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. Another early game land card. Then we have the Temples. The Temples all enter the battlefield tapped, and they scry 1 when they enter the battlefield. So Temple of Malice taps to add black or red. Temple of Triumph taps to add red or white. And Temple of Silence taps to add white or black. Then we have Clifftop Retreat, a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you already control a mountain or a plains, and it taps to add red or white. We have Battlefield Forge, which is a land that taps to add colorless, or you can tap it for red or white. If you do, it deals 1 damage to you. We have Bajuka Bog, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards from target player's graveyard, and it taps to add a black mana to your mana pool. So this is really great in any black deck, because very often you're going to have to deal with someone's graveyard. Really great at just killing those graveyard themed decks. Next we have Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, which is a legendary land, and it says each land is a swamp in addition to its other types. So even Dark Depths, which normally doesn't tap to add any mana to your mana pool, but if you have Urborg out, you can actually still tap Dark Depths to add black mana to your mana pool. So great mana fixing land. It also unfortunately gives all your opponents swamps in addition to their other land types as well, but usually that's not a big deal. Then we have Vault of the Archangel, which taps to add a colorless, or you can pay 2, a white and a black, and tap it, and creatures you control gain Death Touch and Lifelink until the end of the turn. So it helps make your creatures into awesome blockers and helps you to gain life. Really great on a land. Next is Ark of Orazca, which has Ascend, and you can tap it for a colorless, or you can pay 5 and tap it and draw a card. Activate this ability only if you have the City's Blessing. So a decent mana sink, a good card to draw us cards because it's on a land, so it's not, taking up a non-land card slot in our deck. Being right on a land is really cool. I put this actually in a lot of commander decks. Next is Mutavault, which is a land that taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 mana and it becomes a 2/2 creature with all creature types until the end of the turn, and it's still a land. So this can turn into a vampire essentially. Next is Unclaimed Territory. As this enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. It taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can tap it for 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type. Next is Nomad Outpost, which enters the battlefield tapped, but it taps to add either red, white, or black mana to your mana pool. Then we have Path of Ancestry, which enters tapped, or you can tap it to add 1 mana to our mana pool of any color in our commander's color identity. When that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, you get to scry 1. That's pretty sweet. Then we have Command Tower, which taps to add 1 mana to our mana pool of any color in our commander's color identity. Very useful in any commander deck. And that brings us to the basic lands. So we have 1, 2, 3 mountains, 1, 2, 3 swamps, and finally we have 1, 2, 3 plains. And that is it. That's our Edgar Markov deck tech. So let me know what you think. Do you like the cards I have in here? Do you have any suggestions for better card draw? Do you have any vampires that you think should go in the deck? Let me know in the comments below. This is Eric from Bane Alley Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.